afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Kelly Terry. I'm the Externship Director at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, William A. Cohen School of Law. I'm going to let my co-panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
I'm Kendall Carew. I'm the Externship Director at Georgia State University College of Law in Atlanta, not to be confused with the University of Georgia in Athens.
I'm Chris Church. I'm at Western Michigan Cooley Law School. I bring an administrative perspective to today. I'm the Associate Dean for Academics, but have kept my position as faculty advisor to the externship program that designs curriculum.
Bob Jones, Notre Dame Law School. I'm Associate Dean for Experiential Programs, and I teach multiple externship classes.
If you guys, there's a hand up there for some materials for you to grab as you come in. So we didn't, well, first of all, thank you for hanging in with us, hanging in there till the end of the day. We appreciate you being here late on a Saturday afternoon. And our session really coincides well, I think, with one of the points made during the plenary this morning. Susan Brooks mentioned how we can use, externships in assessment for our assessment of our institutional learning outcomes, and that's exactly what we're going to focus on this afternoon. This is basically the roadmap for the next 75 minutes or so. We're just going to do a little bit of an overview of the institutional assessment process, just the steps in that and how it works. Then Bob is going to talk about what he's doing at Notre Dame and how he's using his student competency self-assessment in their institutional process. And Kendall is going to talk about how she's using data from her supervisor evaluations. Then Chris is going to kind of tie it all together and talk about how she's using data from both supervisor and student evaluations, and then also bring in sort of that administrative viewpoint that she just mentioned. And then we have an exercise at the end where hopefully going to give you a chance to sort of think about the data that you have in your programs that can contribute to your institutional assessment process. My guess is that everybody in this room has kind of a treasure trove of data, and really it's just a question of sort of how you harvest it and bring it into that institutional process. There we go. So we just wanted to start out with, everybody's probably really familiar with the ABA standards, and they're in that packet of materials that we gave you. But we just wanted to set the stage by pointing out the ABA landscape and the standards that govern what we're talking about this afternoon. So I think from the show of hands during the plenary session this morning, every school has now adopted its learning outcomes. So you've covered sort of that standard 302 requirement. Standard 314 talks about the formative and summative assessment requirements. And then what we're really going to drill into this afternoon is standard 315 and that institutional assessment process that standard requires. This slide just gives you kind of a good visual of the institutional assessment process. Again, everybody has hit that first box there in the circle of identifying their outcomes. The next step in that usually is to sort of take your general outcome statements and then break those down into their component parts, which are the competencies, and then translate further those competencies into the rubrics that you're going to use to assess, again, on this institutional law school level. Usually then there's a mapping process where you map your outcomes to your curriculum to see which courses are covering those outcomes, where you are teaching those outcomes in each part of the curriculum. And then the fourth step is assessing attainment of those outcomes. And again, that's really going to be our focus today. This slide makes it look like it's this perfectly linear process where you just march from one step to the next. But that's in reality not usually how it happens, because usually you're moving sort of back and forth between these steps. When you map your outcomes to your curriculum, you can find that you have a gap in your curriculum, and that raises questions that you have to answer. So, for example, we had as one of our outcomes that our students would be able to manage a law practice. When we actually mapped our curriculum, we discovered we didn't have a course that was required where they had to learn law office management. So we had to decide, okay, are we going to add something to the curriculum, or are we going to, change the outcome? And we decided that was not one of the most critical things that we needed to be teaching. So we changed our outcomes to delete that one. So it's not as perfect as it would appear. It is kind of this, reiterative process. This is what we're really going to be focusing on today. So this process, we're really getting into the evaluation stages. And this just sort of sets out, again, the subparts, the steps in that fourth part of the previous slide, which I like to call the circly slide. So just picking your outcome to assess, identifying the methods that you're going to use to assess it, implementing those methods, then evaluating that data. And that's really, those last two are really the key steps, evaluating and using the data to make decisions. If you don't close the loop and do that, then everything that came before has really just been a waste of your time. And most of this is what's going to be in your assessment plan. As part of that institutional assessment process, you're going to create a document that is your roadmap for assessing all of your outcomes. And you don't have to assess every outcome every year. That's not really the best practice for assessment. That's not what the ABA expects. Really, it's you get through in the cycle between your site visits, you should assess, each outcome at least once. So you have data to produce for your site visits when those come around. Just wanted to talk for a minute about some of the assessment methods you can use. The term embedded assessment, those are just assignments that you are already doing in your courses. Those are work products that students are creating as part of the regular curriculum. I would strongly encourage everyone, to the extent you can, to use those embedded assessments for your institutional outcomes assessments. So is that memos that students are writing in their RWA classes? Can you use settlement agreements that maybe they draft in their lawyering skills class? Is it some sort of capstone project, that they produce during their third year? It really is more efficient and will save you time. If you can find, and again, this is finding that data that you already have in the courses that you're teaching. The ABA standards allow you to use other assessment options as well. What typically are called add-on assessments, so those could be exit interviews that you're doing as 3Ls graduate, surveys of some type, to have students evaluate their own learning. But those are typically things that you're not doing as part of your regular course. The assessment literature talks about direct measures and indirect measures. Direct measures being students' responses to an instrument. So is it a response to an essay question? Is it a writing assignment? Is it a trial brief they've drafted? Is it an interview, maybe a mock interview in a simulation course, or a real interview in a clinic or an externship? So it's kind of, to me, it's the difference between direct and indirect measures is kind of like the difference between direct evidence and indirect evidence, or circumstantial evidence, in sort of the trial setting. Because your indirect measures usually require an inference about student learning. They're not direct evidence of that learning. So the indirect measures tend to be things where we ask students to evaluate themselves, reflect on their own learning. So like a self-assessment, self-evaluation, even it kind of a stretch, I guess, but even placement data could be considered an indirect measure, because the inference is, well, if graduates are getting jobs, then our employers think they're competent, and they have achieved the outcomes that we want. I don't think I've had debates with people about the label, whether something is direct or indirect. I don't think the label really matters all that much. It's good to have as much evidence as you can. So if you can have a variety of direct and indirect measures, that just gives you more information to evaluate. And then these are just some examples of different types of assessment evidence, so direct and indirect. And so you can think about your courses, your externship courses, and what kinds of assignments that you're giving that will generate this kind of data that you can use in your assessment process. All right, I think that's all for me. Bob, you're up.
If you have the packet packet, we have color-coded it so you can easily follow along. So on the pink or salmon pages, you'll find the PowerPoint. And then what Bob's about to talk about are on the green pages.
So the organizing principle for our presentations is small to big. Think of me as small. I have a kind of simple assessment tool that I use. I offer it as an example of one piece of a bigger puzzle. This is a student self-assessment tool that is simple, it's quick, it's off the shelf, and I'm providing all the materials that you need to do it. But here's what it is, very simply. Students complete a survey. They rate themselves on a 1 to 5 scale on 20 competencies that have been identified by our faculty. We went through this year-long process. 20 competencies that our faculty thought were important for an effective lawyer to have. Not surprisingly, after looking at things for a year, we came up with a list that looks a whole lot like other lists that people come up with for what makes for competent lawyers. So students just self-rate. Where do they think they are at this moment? We do it at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester. I do it toward the end. I use it for pedagogical reasons. At the beginning of the semester, I want them to look at this list and think about it and think about where they are. It helps them form learning goals. And then at the end of the semester, it's a vehicle for them to think about how far they've developed and progressed during the semester. Just to refer back to Kelly's taxonomy, it's an embedded assessment. This is something I do anyway for learning purposes. I guess it's indirect if you want to add that. This is an easy thing. It's 3 minutes of class time twice during the semester, and then a little bit of processing work. And it can be used, as I'll show you, I think the results can be aggregated for a lot of classes for institutional assessment. So what I do is first day of class, first day of externship class, I give students the list of these competencies. It's in your packets, all of this is in your packets, and I give you a link to a box folder where these documents can be found as well. By the way, I apologize, I just looked and saw how long the link is. It's like worse than the worst Wi-Fi password you've ever seen, but anyway, it's there. So I give them the list of competencies. We talk about them, like this is kind of a revelation for students because it's like what a lot of us talk about, most of us talk about in our externship courses about what makes an effective lawyer and how this class is going to help them address these. And then I give them this survey instrument that you have and I say, take 3 minutes, rate yourself where you think you are, don't overthink it, gut level, where are you on the scale, and then I collect them. And we talk about them a little bit. We talk about learning goals and how this might influence what they want their learning goals to be for the semester. Then about a week or so before the end of the semester, I do the same thing again. I've collected the first one. I don't give it back to them. I give them a fresh survey. I don't show them what their results were or remind them from the first time around. I just give them a survey and say, 3 minutes, gut level, where do you think you are today on these criteria? And then I put those in an Excel spreadsheet. The Excel spreadsheet is in box. It's like, shelf ready. And then I give them a report that shows comparatively where they thought they were at the beginning of the semester, where they thought they were at the end. And then I have a sort of final journal reflection or written reflection, and I ask them to take those results and reflect on them. I give them a prompt. I think I put a prompt in the packet. So that's the gist. So This is the first page of the survey. Again, you have it. I won't dwell on it. I have, oh, you already have a question?
Just a logistics question. You said you give them a report. How do you do that? Because they take the survey class?
Yeah, I email, my assistant helps me, and a student assistant just to load the numbers in. It's not that onerous, and then we email
Okay.
to the students. We email the spreadsheet.
All right, thanks. Sorry.
So I've created a little, and this is not scientific, but I've created a little scale that's at the top of the page for what the numbers represent. So here's a sample report for an individual student. This particular student worked at our local legal services office. And the middle column is how she rated herself at the beginning of the semester. The next column to the right is at the end, and then the last column compares, the two. And you can see that for this student, there are some categories where the student thought she had advanced, some where she didn't, that are zeros. There's even one, number 15, financial accounting and economic literacy, where she rated herself lower at the end of the semester than the beginning, which I assume means, oh, I didn't realize how much I didn't know, or I didn't really realize what this competency was about. Now I do. She rated herself on number 9, representational skills, +2, so thought she had really advanced on that, which kind of makes sense. She was in a legal services office. She had a lot of contact with clients. So it kind of makes sense. And then at the bottom, this spreadsheet produces a graph that kind of visualizes it. So the blue line represents the answers at the beginning of the semester, and the left-hand axis is how frequently the student rated herself at a particular level. So the peak at 3 means that her most common self-rating the first time around was a 3, and the red line is at the end of the semester, and the peak at 4 means the most common self-rating she gave herself at the end of the semester was a 4. So it kind of visually shows the student how she thinks she progressed during the semester. It's kind of a reinforcement. It's a positive message. I don't claim scientific validity for this, but self-evaluation is, but there's something to it. I also aggregate this for the whole class, and it's a little more nuanced because so I get fractions and so forth. And I use this as a way to assess, to some extent, how I'm doing in the class. There are certain things that I'm emphasizing, and I want to know if students seem to be getting something out of it. So I spend a lot of time on ethics and personal professional identity. Number 1, I'm happy to see that students at least self-rated themselves 1.45 points higher on that. There are other things that I just don't deal with in class. You could look at the financial and economic literacy at the bottom. They're barely progressing. Now, part of what's going on here is that they're learning not just through the class, but through their placements. So this is a kind of blending of what they're learning on site and what they're learning in class. So there's a comparative graph. And you could expand this infinitely. This is one class. You could dump all your externship courses, your clinics and externships together. I mean, you could expand this as much as you want and produce broader results, again, based on self-evaluation for the school. And actually, we have a system at our university, a software package called Qualtrics. I don't know how common it is. I'm in the process of teaching myself that and putting this into Qualtrics so that by next fall, this will take 0 time. Students can do it on their phone. It'll self-generate and send them an email. It'll be like almost a zero investment of time on my part. So, how does this relate to institutional assessment? So we all have to be doing formative assessment. That's part of the standards. This is formative assessment. It's helping students, as they go along, take stock of where they are, where they need to go, how they're developing. We obviously, under 303, have to give opportunities for self-evaluation. Interpretation 315.1 specifically includes student evaluation as an acceptable assessment method. Externships, Bill Adams said at lunch today, gosh, externships are a particularly relevant type of course to do institutional assessment for. You can...
Well, after we stumped him with that question, he goes, oh, yeah. I thought that was funny. He should be here.
That question was a plant, of course, but
No, he'd be impressed with that thoughtful tale.
so you can tailor this obviously any way you want. You can substitute your learning outcomes for this. By the way, our learning outcomes are more condensed than these 20 competencies, but the institutional assessment people at our school looked at it and they said, well, these map right onto your broader institutional learning outcomes. Like, you don't need to rewrite these to be worded exactly like your institutional outcomes, but you can do whatever you want. Scalable. Oh, go ahead, Christine.
Well, I don't want to interrupt here, but do you show the students a comparative report of how their progress compares to the other students who have ranked themselves in the class?
I have not done that.
Well, it might not be a good idea.
Yeah, so, because I really mean this to be a tool for their self-reflection, and the thing is, they've all started at different places, they've ended at different places, and my students, I have a general externship class, so they've done different kinds of placements. I'm not sure how relevant that would be. So, Doug, turning it over.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the documents that are in your packet that are white. And a little bit of how Georgia State has used externships to evaluate institutional learning outcomes. So the first thing I have in the packet is it's a forthcoming article that Andy Curcio wrote for the Journal of Legal Education. My understanding is that these are the final page proofs that will be coming out next month, and she gave me permission to go ahead and give this to you now so that you would have a better sense after the session as to really the nitty-gritty of how Georgia State went about not only setting our institutional learning outcomes, but then how we plan to assess them in a way that's going to get faculty buy-in, hopefully, and make it as easy as possible for our faculty to engage in this process. So just generally, like Bob said, we went through a process where we surveyed all of our different classes, what were we teaching, what were we assessing already, to try to gauge what was important to us as a law school to have our graduates leave with. After we did that, we came up with our agreed upon learning outcomes and really focused on what are we teaching and assessing already. Because if we're not teaching and assessing it already, it likely won't remain an outcome. So let's start with that. And then the curriculum committee met and developed standard rubrics for each of those competencies, for each of those outcomes. And then also decided, well, we don't want to just rely on what we're doing, what we're assessing as faculty, but also what are students saying about themselves through the Lessee responses, right? So I don't know how many of you, I imagine a lot of you get Lessee reports from your students. So that's the self-assessment that we rely on. And then also, what are our site supervisors saying about our students? and in that way, trying to get a 360-degree feedback loop. So what we are doing is taking 4 years, 4-year cycles, we're doing just 2 outcomes per year, all right? And so the way that it's working is that the rubric that they've come up with for a particular learning outcome is completed after the faculty member has graded everything. So in other words, contracts. We want to know how are our students doing with learning outcomes 1 and 2. Okay, these are the first ones we're tackling. And that's the biggies, right, as far as what traditionally we think about in legal education, the knowledge components. So how graduates will demonstrate knowledge and comprehension of substantive and procedural laws, generally including rules of procedure, common law, statutory law, administrative law, and constitutional law. And then the second outcome, graduates will demonstrate effective legal analysis and reasoning skills to address client problems and/or policy issues and achieve client objectives. So what they've determined is, the curriculum committee has decided that it's going to be measured in torts, civil procedure 2, contracts 2, wills, trusts, and estates, administrative law, criminal procedure investigations, which is a 2 or 3L class, using the rubric. So what happens is the torts professor will go ahead, teach the class as normal, will grade the class, however it is that the professor wants to grade the class, and then we'll take this standard rubric and we'll complete it after the grades have come in. It takes about 5 minutes for them to do it, because you've already graded and assessed the class. And so it's just one more step using this standard rubric. So this is generally what the rubric looks like, and actually in the article, which I had the benefit of being able to read and provide feedback to Andy before, as she was in this process, so I got a better sense of exactly what we were doing as an institution. But if you look on page 28, I think it's 28, of her article, you will see that the rubric has even been tweaked since we started with it, right? So obviously it's in process. But I want to give you this idea of what the general rubric looks like for the rest of our faculty in assessing, for example, how students are doing with respect to legal analysis, use of facts, legal analysis, critical reasoning, and legal analysis policy, because those are the things that they're then looking to my site supervisor evaluations to get information from as well, okay? They only want to know about these 3 things from externships. So on my site supervisor evaluation, the final site supervisor evaluation, I have assessment categories: exemplary, which means practice ready, competent, developing, and needs significant work. And I actually asked specifically, this is a kind of a snapshot of these assessment categories that are on the rubric for the regular faculty members who are teaching torts, contracts, etc., and what they're completing. This is how it looks on my externship site evaluation form. So when the final assessment of my students by the site supervisor is going to also kind of track that. Now, I have recently been asked to change my terminology from exemplary to aspirational. I'm actually not going to do that, because I don't think practitioners are going to understand what aspirational means. Also, I was asked to change needs significant work to whatever critical deficiencies. Again, I don't think my site supervisors are going to be real about actually marking that category, because they're not going to want to say that anybody has a critical deficiency. So, and they've been okay with that, and understanding why I'm saying that. So it doesn't have to track your rubric specifically, but at least we're getting some feedback, some data from the site supervisors that is asking the same questions, right? So what I provide to my curriculum committee that is collecting all of this data is a chart that essentially says, okay, I have 29 externs this semester. This is actually from last semester. So 9 of them are 2Ls, 20 of them are 3Ls. So in the 3L category, you'll see, it's actually, I think, a positive that we've got, for example, in legal analytical ability, and I have an NA category in case for some reason they're not doing a legal analysis. I'm not really sure why there are 2 in that category. But this is telling me that maybe I need to do a little bit more training with my supervisors about filling out the final evaluation. But 14 are exemplary in legal analytical ability, 13 in problem-solving skills, and then the rest are competent. No one are competent, are competent. And then no one in these categories was marked needs significant work. But I do get that, based on how I've defined needs significant work. My site supervisors are not scared to mark that. And actually, you'll see on the evaluation form that I have an explanation narrative on the back that says, if you did mark needs significant work, can you tell me a little bit more about why? What should the student be doing? Or even developing. So that's how my school is using this data. They're taking this and they're running it with the self-assessment that they're getting from Leslie, and they're running it with the data they're getting from the rubrics that are completed after the contracts professor has taught that class, and together with that hopefully 360-degree look at the full educational experience of a student in a given year of law school, kind of where they are on the continuum of meeting that institutional learning outcome. Yes?
Do you have a midterm eval that your supervisors do with the students as well?
I do, but they don't use that.
Does it look the same?
It has the same categories, but it's not, I don't define it. So, for example, it'll have these categories such as research and analysis skills, formal oral presentation skills, etc. But it doesn't have any definitional things on it. And that is something that I'm going to, I think, work on changing now that I know that this is being used on a broader level than just for the students. So I always looked at the mid-semester evaluation form as kind of a check-in, a forced opportunity to have an oral discussion, even more than a written. But I might be doing more with that. And I also have them do a mid-semester self-evaluation. Yes?
Do you have your in-house clinicians use this same form with your students? So I would think that you're doing it in the other courses, you're asking your outside supervisors, but your in-house clinicians are doing the same work with your students.
They are not right now.
Could they be? Could you imagine that they would use the same form at the same times to capture even more data? Because they're in the same position as a field supervisor, and one would hope even more. Right?
Yes.
Facile with this.
I could see that being the case. I think that they are really trying to minimize the intrusiveness, and there are other competencies I'm fairly certain will be focused on the clinical education component, because they're being consistently addressed there and assessed. So, not that this isn't, but I think that they've pinpointed clinics for some other feedback points. Yeah.
Kind of a little confused. I thought when you were talking about both the professor who graded all the exams and then took 5 minutes to do the scoring, and then the way you presented this, that I thought this was showing whether the graduates of the institution as a group were sort of achieving sort of the right outcomes. But just a minute ago, you talked about individual assessment and whether the individual student was doing it. So I assume you're not, this is collectively a judgment about whether the students that semester were getting it, not each individual, right?
This is just the data that I submit. I take the evaluation form and I say how many students got exemplary, how many got competent, how many got developing, who were 3Ls, how many did it, who were 2Ls. And that's all I submit to them. Then I let my curriculum committee take this data and the data they're getting from the rubrics and come together with a holistic view of the student.
Of the student, though, that's what I'm
No,
asking.
no, it's not an individual student, but like that, the student experience is what I mean.
Group of students at that particular
Yes.
moment or
Yes.
year of graduate level.
It's not at an individual
Okay,
student level
okay.
because of,
Right.
yeah, they don't want, that's why there's no names on this. I mean, not just because I'm presenting it here, but this is literally how I give it to them.
And I'm a little confused about how in the world, since I grade 113 professional responsibility exams, what is it that I say afterwards? I think I did pretty well, or not so well, or?
You complete the rubric that's on page 30, sorry, and I'm going over on my time, but on page 30
For each student.
for each student.
And then it's
So-
collectively
so-
aggregated.
Or sorry, page 28.
So it's 5 minutes extra after I thought you meant I grade all of them and then it's just 5 more minutes.
Oh, no,
5 minutes
per
each
student.
exam. Oh, geez, wow.
Oh.
Oh, I'm not doing it anymore. Do the math, 5 minutes times 113, okay?
I mean, I think that I certainly don't think it
Great
would take
idea.
5 minutes to do, 100. So,
Okay.
All right, well, let me start by asking a question for this group. How many of you could use more money in your budget and resources? Okay, so I'm talking as an administrator who works with the budgets and is looking at how do I apportion out resources to meet the mission of the law school. And one of the things about the externship program, and I mean, I'm telling you, I literally do this every year, is to say, here's how much money our externship program generated by adding up all the credit hours and multiplying it by the tuition rate. And here's how much the externship program has a budget. And so here's how much money we made, right? So then when I go to say, I need some more resources, I have some ears. Well, several years ago when the ABA came out with Standard 315, I heard Bill Adams at a conference just like this say one of the measures are capstone courses. One of the measures that can be used for assessment are employers, and I'm thinking, I have a lot of externship supervisors. They're not employers, but they're outside lawyers who are evaluating our students. We also had done a self-study back in 2013, and that's when I started doing some very serious work with evaluations. We are a school that uses Google Suite, and so I can create a Google form. All of the answers go straight to a spreadsheet. So now I have data that I can manipulate and be able to get some information from. So what we do is we send out to our students a midterm eval and an end of the term self-assessment. Copies of that self-assessment are in your materials. I have the purple. And so this is the stuff that we do and we use to help us assess how well did our students do. We also have a evaluation that we send to our field supervisors. They do a midterm eval. The midterm eval is a little shorter because it's really what are they doing well, where are they struggling. We want you to meet with the student and go over this evaluation and give them some plans for how to work on these things for the second half of the semester. But then we also have a end of term evaluation that the supervisors fill out. Now I'm really lucky because I have faculty supervisors. Probably 80% of our full-time faculty are supervising externs. And so I also have a faculty evaluation at the very end. And I want to show you how we've started to use this. So this is one example of one of our JV program outcomes, which is knowledge. Knowledge is, such a large topic. And then you identify what are your performance indicators. And being able to write and articulate your legal analysis is an important part of this. And so we ask, has your extern produced any written work for you? If somebody's in a prosecutor's office, they might not be producing a lot of written work because they're in court with their supervisor and preparing for court. But what we find is that probably 90% answered yes to that. So if they answer yes, because with Google Forms you can do these kind of decision trees, then we ask what kind of written materials did your extern produce? And one of the things that we discovered was that most of them have their externs doing legal memorandum, which reinforced for us that our research and writing class that makes them do a legal memorandum, that's a good idea, because that's what they're being asked to do in their externship. Then we ask, how would you rate the quality of their written work? And we give them sort of a scale and ask them to just pick one of these answers. But then I can take that data and I can put it together for our administration. And there's a copy of one of our older reports, just so you can see how we use that data to report back to our administration. And I go to our board of directors and I report. This is how our students are doing. Because for us, these externs are all 3Ls. And so this is a capstone experience. Clinic or externship is a requirement for graduation. And yes, Carrie, our clinical people do the same types of evaluations so that we've got this. But when you start seeing graphs and information, then that really appeals to administrators. They love seeing sort of qualitative data. Now we also use our student evaluations to capture data. So we also have skills outcome and we have performance indicators. And one of our performance indicators is that every single student will advocate on behalf of a client and participate in at least one legal process to resolve a dispute. That's a core competency at our law school. And so we ask the students, did you do it? We also ask the supervisors some of those similar questions. We ask, what lawyering skills did you observe during your externship? Remember, we have to talk about what are the things that you can observe, what are your opportunities for performance. So we ask things you've been able to see, and they have to check off, and they can do more than one box. This is anything that you were able to observe during your externship. Similarly, we ask them, what were the things that you've been able to do during your externship? It's not just observe, but actually do. And then we also talk to our faculty supervisors, because one of our performance indicators is that our students have the ability to engage in professional reflection and self-assessment. So the faculty's been reading the journals, responding to the journals. Our students can do from 3 credits to 10 credits. So there could be a various number of days that they're actually at their externship. And our students have to journal for the first probably 4 or 5 weeks, every single day they work. They have to send their supervisor an email. What did you learn today? Not what did you do today? And so if they don't, and so the faculty respond back to them with how to reflect. Let me see what you're thinking. Let me see what you're struggling with. What surprised you? What did you do well? What would you do differently, right? The whole clinical questions that we asked. And so then they have to, at the end of the term, this is how I know whether my students have passed their externship, because it's a pass-fail. This is one of the questions that the faculty supervisors have to answer. And so, this is after. This is not my slide, that's all right. So to just sort of walk through that, Those are the different kinds of data that are available, and it's easy to do. Once you've developed the metrics for the questions that you're going to ask. And then you can use that to say to your administration, look, here's how this program can help us prepare for the next time the ABA is coming to demonstrate how we are meeting those learning outcomes and the JD program outcomes that we've developed for our institution.
Sure, do you guys want to, yeah, I have a question. So at our school, I'm not faculty, no one really like actually is faculty, so we were sort of in initially on the learning outcomes, the ideas, we helped give ideas. When we got those sort of the almost final versions, because our externships and clinics aren't required, everything sort of dropped out. The faculty weren't, they're like, oh, it's great that some of the students will be getting that, but we don't really need to be collecting it. So sure, if you want to make graphs, but has anyone else found, I found it because it's not a graduation requirement, there was no interest, even though we can easily do some of this stuff, but I was. Right. It's harder when it's not a graduation requirement because I think it's kind of an issue of sample size. You don't have enough of a sample to say that, most of our graduates or all of our graduates have achieved competency, because if it's not a required part of the curriculum, then it's not representative of the student body as a whole. And what we're doing is, we have made clinic or externship a requirement. So, we're going to use our clinics and externships for our problem solving skill and develop, kind of going back to Carrie's point, sort of a common evaluation tool that we can use in both the clinics and externships to assess that. I would say, though, even if it's not required, I think the more data you have, it's just useful information. So I would encourage you to keep collecting that and presenting it to your administration.
But what if you created a document that can be used for whatever they use to qualify for their 6 experiential credits? So you might have a more sophisticated one for clinic and externship, but one that's common to your simulation and everything, and you're saying, for everyone who took the 6, whatever they did, here's the aggregate, looking for that common thing.
Right.
So, and it might be, there's additional questions for some things, but you sort of find what is the common elements for all of the experience. I don't know if anybody's already done that. This is occurring to me, I haven't done that, and I'm now thinking I should. Because everyone has to hit the 6 credits now.
Right.
I have a strong opinion about this. I cannot find any basis in any ABA documents to say that the only things you can use in doing this institutional assessment are things that every student does. I think it doesn't make any sense. As Terry says, you're encouraged to look at a variety of data. You all have a pink sheet with the standards on. Interpretation 315.1 gives you a variety of things that the ABA says you can look at, which obviously includes things that don't apply to every student, surveys of attorneys, judges and alumni and so forth. And I think it's a self-defeating proposition to say we can only measure the absolutely universal common things. You have all kinds of information, all kinds of data. That would mean that if you're not at a school with mandatory clinics or externships, that you shouldn't consider any information that you derive from those. So I think my own opinion is all data is good data. Obviously, the more students it applies to, the more useful it is. So, yeah.
Carol?
This is more of a political question. So I coach your curriculum committee, and I am anticipating that I ask our internal faculty to do what your school handle is doing, that I would get a lot of pushback. I also anticipate, just because in our school, our clinical faculty handles the externship and clinical program, and we also do everything else that people ask us to do. So I think I'd also get pushback from externship/clinical faculty saying, well, we do everything as it is. So just politically, how is this played out in your school?
Well,
And then your thoughts?
I did want to add something to Bob's question. So that chart that I was showing had to do with how the curriculum assessment committee is using the data from my final supervisor evaluations that my students are getting back. I require that the students meet with their supervisor to get those forms back. They come to me through the student, so the student is seeing that feedback, right? So they're getting a sense of where they're at that point in time, at least according to the supervisor they've been working with throughout the course of the semester. Likewise, with these rubrics that the faculty are completing, okay? And truly, they've told me, it's not like everybody on our faculty is like, yes, please let me do more work, at all. And that's why it's staggered, that's why it's not in every class that it's being used, okay? Even though there's way more classes, I'm sure, that are dealing with outcomes 1 and 2 than the ones that are identified. Not all of them are required, either, of all students. But that rubric can be an easy way also to give a point at the end of first semester of law school, at the end of second semester of law school, to give formative feedback. So you can actually, so to your point, Bob, I do think that there's the idea that the students individually will see potentially the rubric that is completed by their contracts 2 professor to see where that they are in relation to the, the goal. And it's just one more piece of that, giving the grade back with some sort of explanation behind it. And it's, I would just encourage you, if you are thinking that this might even be remotely something to consider, to kind of read how Andy's described it, because I'm sure I'm not doing it justice.
I think I would do it differently if I did this. I think that I would, when I'm writing my exam, identify in each question what are certain things that I expect I'm grading, and then depending on, I do a 100-point system, how many points they got on it. You know what I mean? So that I wouldn't have to do this extra work at the end. If somebody got 8 of 10 on the question, and the question had to do with this, then it's, you know what I mean?
But then you know that 8 out of 10 is whatever the,
Right.
what, yes, that's what they're doing. Yeah.
I would just say that my mere number
Yeah.
is enough, and I don't have to go do anything at the end, because using.
I think that's the idea.
All the rest, it's just there.
No, I mean, I think that that's the idea, is that you based on your, whatever they got on your rubric,
Right,
it just easily translates.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you aggregate that for your institutional process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't see where, Carol, well, I mean, good luck on your next ABA site visit if your
Right.
people won't do
Yeah.
this.
Right.
I mean, where else are you gonna get the data? It's, instead of making up all this new stuff, I love your points. It's all right there.
Yeah.
We do a little bit of front loading of thinking about how we're gonna set it up. Voila! And yes, it's a little more time, or you tweak the way you're grading so that you're automatically using it, but good luck telling the ABA, I didn't wanna do more work. Not doing you, but I mean, that's what you would tell your, that's what the curriculum
I
committee
think
would
I was
say.
looking
Oh,
for
good luck.
guidance just politically, how you
Yeah.
get people to do this stuff.
Yeah.
Because it is, if you've got a shrinking faculty, as we do,
Yeah.
people are being pushed to do more every
Right.
day. And whether it's helping students pass the bar or anything else. So adding on one more thing sometimes is really difficult. So I was just asking for
Yeah.
political insight. I obviously think assessment's a great thing. I think it's very helpful for
Yeah,
student
for me.
learning. And I would have people do more of it, but just politically, any guidance or thoughts?
Well, I have a thought, and this is where your regional accrediting body might come into play and be helpful. So our regional accrediting body is the HLC, and one of its requirements is that you have, a critical mass of faculty involved in your institutional assessment process. It can't just be the 3 people on your assessment committee. They want to see an institution-wide involvement. So that's something that, we're going to use, and that's not in the ABA standards, but we still have to comply with the HLC requirement for our overall university accreditation process. So there may be resources there that you can point to. Chrissy, you had a...
I'll make it real quick because I know there's other people. I'm in both the camps here, so political issues are real. And I think that the leaders that are doing assessment how you do it, other schools are studying.
Right.
And I'm gonna be candid, I am not confident that the ABA site visits are gonna ask poignant questions to really assess that the assessment that's going on is actually collaborative or a full horizontal or vertical assessment of a curriculum. And so, in full disclosure, I was a question at the end that said, do you really see the ABA as the future of regulating legal education? Because I think, to your point, it's your regional accrediting bodies that are really going to serve that assessment need.
Right, right.
Kelly, if I could kind
Yeah.
of jump in on a political question. One of the key things with this whole assessment process that gave me such great peace, because I will tell you, I went to, you've got to do this. We're also accredited by the HLC. They didn't like our assessment processes. They wanted something else. And I go to one of their conferences and I'm like, oh my God, this is so overwhelming. This is so overwhelming for a law school to engage in this process. And the one thing that I came back with that made me feel so much better, and this goes back to your point as well, is that you don't assess every student, every semester, every outcome. You pick data points that will help you see, are you making progress in your student learning? Can you track your progress from one year to the next year? And that just made things so much more doable. And to your question about politics, you have to figure out how you can do this that is the least intrusive. So like for us, one of the things we're looking at with doctrinal faculty are some anchor questions. We have several sections of, say, torts 2 going on. Every professor writes their own exam. Well, we want to see some anchor questions that are going across all of the sections that test something that is a performance indicator for our learning outcomes. That's not hard, because the faculty are going, oh cool, I don't have to write so many brand new questions. We're going to have some departmental questions that will be across the board. So you want to look at politically how to do this in a way that isn't adding more and more responsibility on the backs of the faculty and your administrative staff, because that's a shrinking resource too.
Kind of one
Yeah.
last. So our faculty is not crazy about assessment and doing a lot more assessment. So one strategy along the lines of what Chris just said, we're developing a survey for our faculty to try to take stock of what assessment is already happening, because there's a lot of assessment in any of our schools. It's happening in a variety of ways across the curriculum and experiential programs, doctrinal. And so we've been meeting with our, institutional assessment gurus at the university to help articulate and identify what are all the things that we might be doing that would count as assessment. We're assembling those into a questionnaire that we're going to give to our faculty. And then the hope is we can look at all that we're already doing and figure out that we're doing a lot, we're a long way there. And then how can we just incrementally build on what we already have going, what people are already doing to get to where we need to be. And we think that'll be a less politically painful way to get our faculty to the finish line.
Right. And I have two sort of follow-up thoughts on that. One is, your assessment committee can do a lot of this work for the faculty. So you had a committee that designed those rubrics. It's literally just here's the rubric, follow it. We're doing that with upper level writing papers. All of our students have to do upper level writing. We created a rubric, and the faculty who are teaching and certifying upper level writing credit are applying that rubric, after they've graded the paper, and they don't have to use the rubric in their grading. They can still grade the way they want to. The other thing I'm going to say, and this is going to sound a little bit preachy, but I'm going to own it. I went back to this slide because this is what this is all supposed to be about, is improving student learning. And that's why we're doing it. It's not, it is for ABA compliance, but that's not really what it's about. And we've been through, we've assessed we've been through 2 cycles, so we've assessed about 3 or 4 outcomes at this point, looking at the data. And it's really revealing. And it is showing the gaps, and it's showing us our shortcomings. And so as part of the selling it to faculty, the political process, I mean, I just have to go back to, this is our job, this is what we're supposed to be doing, is teaching and improving learning, and this is the method by which we do it. Brittany?
And this kind of goes to that point, but in any of your schools looking using portfolio assessment, where you actually took the rubrics and the stuff and gathered them together and did audits of them at the end to try to do an assessment?
We have not done that.
And you haven't heard of?
And I don't know, is anybody doing that? I know that's an often written about approach. I don't know how many schools are actually doing that.
We were gonna start and fell apart.
Yeah.
But it was before the learning outcomes, it was a really ambitious project.
Yeah.
And we did a few prototypes and it's sort of shelved right now.
So it does seem to your point, what Kendall said,
Yeah.
and to your point is that if we actually, if the students can actually see their progress
Right.
together and someone
Right.
would meet and counsel them and looking at the areas, it would fit, it could just work towards their brain.
I think that our goal is to be able to take, like I said, you could take contracts to professor, I mean, that would be the ideal, Bob, is to like work it into the questions so that when you just have the numbers on your rubric at the end, you just know which category, and it takes a minute to fill out that rubric. I mean, that would be ideal. You take that, you're able to give that to the student, so they're not just looking at a possibly marked up exam, but they're actually seeing where they are on the spectrum, and then they can check in at the different points within the context of their legal educational experience. The other thing politically that I would say, and I think that this, I think the benefit of assessment at my school is we have people like Andy who are very into assessment. She has a lot of political capital and respect of people as to this is how I think is best to do it, and we kind of just listen to her. And the other thing is, in my school, we are still focusing primarily on we need to teach our students, because that's, when it comes down to it, if we are not getting students out who are able to be successful in practice, then we're not doing our job. And so I think that's the mentality, and so I do think that drives a lot of what we do.
I promise it's my last time. So here's the hanging question in the sky. When you find out what your weaknesses are, and the data shows, and it points to one professor, or 2 professors, or a series of courses.
Yep.
What is the administration going to do, and have you been in that situation? Because I think that's where the fear is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're in that process right now. I won't reveal the subject matter, but we, in our most recent assessment, we discovered an area where student performance is significantly lower than in other areas. And so that's going to be, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That's going to be in the assessment report that goes to the whole faculty, because the numbers are what they are. The bar data is what it is, in that subject matter category. So, we're going to, you can only do so much. You can suggest and make recommendations, but you have to hope that those people who teach those courses care and will see that students are not getting it, and they will take corrective measures.
So I don't want to leave here depressed and overwhelmed. So I just want to see how I can come up with a solution, right? So as Associate Dean that oversees 18 law clinics and externship of 25 people, it's daunting to me to think about making sure they're all doing the right thing. So my takeaway from this is that I need to think about coming up with common forms, probably online,
Yep.
that have very common rubrics, right? Research and, you know what I mean? And that I can get all my people to buy into it. And I could have every student have it done midterm and final, you know what I mean? Because right now, I've got so many people,
Yeah.
I gotta do something because I don't want someone knocking on my door. But I also realize if I don't do it, it's not gonna get done.
Right,
So
right.
it's just, but I think it's about some common forms. You know?
Absolutely. And making it as easy as possible for people. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that, so I've been chosen one of the auditors before, I don't know why. how they sold it to me, one was they didn't give me a choice. It was coming from the university level, not from the college level, so fun. Two, though, they gave me the Office of Faculty and Instruction Development. They brought in a bunch of college of English education people, and they actually taught us how to create our rubrics for evaluating our course. Which if it hadn't been for education people, I was trying to do it before the OFID, and I'm like, oh, I don't know how to do this. So without them helping me do that, it would have taken forever. Third, that they told me politically that we're not picking on you. We're going to do this for everybody on a rolling basis. Every class is going to get selected. You know, once every 3 years. You know, you're going to have to do this. So then you feel a little less like, why is it always me? And then they did. And then they really are choosing people to audit now and showing me that it's not. So that was a good, it's not fun, but you know, like, into it.
Yeah, but you know, we ask our students to reflect on their performance. We, you know, got to put our money where our mouth is and do the same thing for our teaching and our curriculum and our programs. We only have about 7 minutes. We were gonna do, oh, and I just wanted to follow up on that point too. Those of you who are at larger universities, you have an Office of Institutional Assessment. You have people on that main campus who are experts in this. You know, if you don't have that on your law school campus, and Bob talked about using the Notre Dame folks for that. So use those resources. Assessment people love it when you come and ask them to help. You want to go ahead and try to do it, or just leave the exercise as a homework? What?
Yeah, toss it out.
Okay, well, what we were going to do, on one of your salmon or coral colored sheets, whatever this is, you see there's a blank chart, and we just had an exercise. You can maybe do this on the plane on the way home. And you don't have to turn it in. It's purely formative. We won't evaluate it. But what we wanted you to do was look at your own law school institutional learning outcomes, and then try to think about whether you have, you know, direct or indirect evidence in your externship courses that relates to those outcomes and can be used to assess them, and that will contribute to your overall institutional process. My guess is that you do have a lot of information there that is valuable, and then you can start thinking about ways to capture it. Any other questions, follow-up thoughts?
Could you give an example? So if we're not, just so we'll just get started.
Sure.
The institutional learning outcome of direct and indirect evidence.
Yeah, well, so these were the types.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, I handy dandy little chart for you.
Excellent.
Do you have drafting assignments, you know, in your externship course? Do you have your students do any sort of skills performance? You know, mock oral arguments? You know, any sort of student work products? Or you may have, you know, and this is where the field supervisor evaluations come in. You know, they are reviewing student work products. You know, so you're getting that information from them. You might have, you know, student self-evaluations or reflections that would tie in with some of your institutional learning outcomes. So it's really just asking you to sort of inventory the assessments that you're using in your course and seeing if they align with your institutional outcomes and produce data for them. All right, well, thank you so much for your engagement.